Hey everyone, Chelsea here. I have a range of techniques to show you today, mostly using Distress Oxide inks. I love these inks and I'm so excited to show you these fun techniques. First off, I want to show you how magical they look on black and craft paper. So Oxide inks are pretty special because they are part dye ink and part pigment ink, so they're a hybrid, and that allows them to sit on top of the paper a little bit more. And when you put them through a stencil like this, I have blended 3 colors together through a stencil and they just kind of glow. You could not do this technique with regular dye inks because they just dye the paper, and so they don't show up on dark cardstocks like this. So I'm going to use one of my favorite color combinations, just picked raspberry, peacock feathers, and mustard seed. So pretty basic pink, yellow, teal. I love that kind of color combination because I know they're all going to mix together really well. And of course, I'm using the inking tools with the little foams just because they blend so well using these. So I'm just going to start off with the mustard seed in the center. So even something as light as a yellow, you can see how well it is actually showing up. And this is a super quick way to create a focal point, to create a background, just putting these inks through a stencil like this. I love how peacock feathers shows up on these dark cardstocks. Oh, my stencil shifted a little bit. I probably should have stuck that down. But there we go. So you can see both on the craft and on the black, typical dye inks would have a problem doing this, but they just look so pretty. Love that. Quick, easy way to use your stencils and blend up a background in no time at all. For this next technique, I'm actually working on a tag cut from watercolor paper. I'm using 2 Distress Oxide inks to blend a background. And then I'm going to be using water through a stencil. So that's why I'm on watercolor paper. You don't have to use watercolor paper, but I do find it takes the water a little bit better. And I'm just going to blend a simple background. You could do several different colors. Get all fancy with it. I'm just picking 2 colors that I like how they blend together and just keep it simple. Really do think this is one of the benefits of the Oxide inks, is just how beautifully they blend. Now you can see here how I'm getting a bit of a line, and that's fine. I just go back with the other color and just soften that out. Add more ink and blend them in together. You can see I've left a couple of fingerprints, but that's because my hands are getting kind of mucky from all this creating. All right. Now, the nice thing with the Oxide inks, to clean up your stencils and to clean up your mat, you just need baby wipe or a cloth, paper towel, something like that. They don't dry permanently to the surface. So now I'm going to grab a stencil. I have my little chevron stencil here. And I'm going to mist with water. So you don't want to soak this. You just want to add some water and remove your stencil fairly quickly. Oh. Probably would help if I filled my bottle a little bit more. So now you can kind of see the pattern just sitting there. I'm going to let that sit there and react. The water shouldn't, as long as it's sitting on a flat surface, should not run or bleed all over the place. It should stay in the design of the stencil. So I'm going to let that just sit there and react for a minute and dry my surface. And by giving it some time to dry before I touch it, it just gives it more time to react with that water. And then I'm just going to take a dry towel. You could use paper towel, and I'm just going to blot that water. Isn't that cool? Now you can see there's areas where I got less water that didn't react as much. So that corner and that corner got a little bit less water. The areas that got more water are more solid with that white, that oxidized look. And then you can see here where I got more speckly because my water mister was almost empty. I got more of like a spitty, speckly application. And so my texture looks more like that. Now, I like that. I like that varied look. And I think it just adds an interesting element to your backgrounds. Now, this could be the first layer of a background. You could go ahead and add stamping to it. You could go ahead and add stenciling with a color, just applying ink through a stencil and add more on top of this. Or you could leave it like this. If I was going to use this on a card or something, I could pop up a little character that I colored or a big bold sentiment, something like that. The options are really endless. So I want to show you this card here. It's not with that technique I just showed you with the water, but it is just using a blended peacock feathers. I just took peacock feathers, blended it all over, took a stencil and added more peacock feathers through the stencil. So you can see those dots show up as darker. And the way that I got this nice crisp edge was I just used some washi tape, and actually I used some thicker washi tape than this. And I just masked off a rectangle and ink blended in the middle, did my stenciling, and then removed it. So it adds a really fun focal point to a card. You can probably see that shine coming off those little splatters. That is from the lime gloss spray. I love using those for splattering. They just look so nice, and they add a little bit of shine as well, which is really cool. The leaves on here and the parrot are all with my colored with the tri-blend markers. So just a fun card. You could swap this out with all different kinds of images. I also want to show you this fun Slimline card. My background is all done with a stencil and with the Seedless preserves, the black soot, and the spice marmalade distress inks. Just basic blending, just using my inking tool and pouncing through the stencil. And it just gives that really cool, kind of chalky looking background. And it even has a little bit of a chalky texture to it when you feel it. And that's just because of the hybrid nature of the ink with the pigment in it. It sits on top of the paper a little bit more than like a dye ink would. And then I used all these cute little images and some circle dies, some stickles, just to add some bling, tri-blend markers for the coloring. I love these little gnomes. They're just so cute. And then the little bats and everything. So a fun Slimline card, fast and easy background. I didn't even need to use any pattern paper on this card. And the distress inks match perfectly. All right, for this one, it's another really simple ink blended background, but really impactful. I basically went for sort of an ombre effect or like a sunset effect using my yellow, orange, pink, and red. So I will pull those colors and show you the application. So I'm going to start with my lightest color. I have my stencil down here, my favorite stencil, and I'm going to use the mustard seed. And just start down here at the bottom. Now, because I'm using several colors and this is a fairly small canvas, I don't want to take them too high, but I am going to overlap them a bit. I wouldn't even need to use this spiced marmalade for the orange because the pink and the yellow mixing together would make an orange, but I just wanted to show you this kind of nice ombre, you know, sunrise, sunset effect that you can get with these inks, and they just blend so beautifully. Candied apple will be my last color, which is the red. And we'll just deepen up that pink with the red. All right. There we go. It's a pretty fiery kind of sunset look. Super easy. And as it dries, you just get that beautiful, soft, chalky look to it. All right, so next up, I am going to show you how the inks can color your texture paste. What I did first was I ink blended a background, then I put the opaque matte texture paste over top. And as it dries, the pigments from the ink actually come up into the white paste to color it. So it's something good to keep in mind. The Oxide inks are not permanent. So if I was to, let's say, spray my tag with the gloss sprays, they are permanent when they're dry. So the texture paste on top would stay white. In this case, the inks are actually going to color that texture paste, which can be a plus or a minus. It's just like something good to keep in mind when you're working so that you get the effect that you want, right? Maybe you want those inks to bleed up and color your paste, but maybe you don't. So then if you don't, you know you want to use something more permanent like the gloss sprays instead of the inks. So I'm just going to grab some colors here and start blending myself a background. I'm going to use different colors than I used on that initial tag. So I got Seedless Preserves. And then I'm going to go up into some chipped Sapphire. You will notice that I'm starting off the edge of my paper and working on. That is primarily just to help lessen the amount of lines. The oxides, they're pretty easy to blend out because they're such wet inks. You don't have to worry a ton about like blending lines, but I got into that habit working with distress inks, just the regular inks, and it's kind of stuck with me, and it does help to reduce how many lines you have going on. Let's grab Mowed Lawn. So I'm just going to put my stencil here over my tag. You can see why I cut down this big stencil into all the smaller pieces, because it's just so easy to use that way. And I'm using my palette knife and texture paste. All right. So this is not something you will see immediately. You're not going to see the coloring immediately. As it dries and as the wet texture paste sits on top of those inks, then you will start to see that color bleeding up. So for this next technique, I'm going to do some stencil shifting. This is a technique that I saw from Jennifer McGuire, and I just love it. I love the impact of the shadow on here. So basically what you want is to pick a color of cardstock. I picked Lagoon, and then also the coordinating ink. So I'm using the Lagoon ink and a stencil. I'm using this hexagon pattern because it's very easy. I find this pattern really easy to shift and kind of keep track of where I'm putting the shadow. So I have a tag already cut out. So I don't want my tag to move, but I don't want to have washi tape on the front. So I'm just taking my tape runner. I'm going to put a little bit on the back of this and stick it to my mat. Okay, and then I can put my stencil over top. I'm going to need washi tape to hold my stencil in place. I'm going to put some at the top and the bottom just so that it's not moving when I don't want it to. I'm actually just going to use a little foam. You want to make sure that you don't use a foam that has Oxide ink on it. You'll need to wash it if you're going to do that. This one already had Lagoon ink on it, but it's not great for your regular dye ink pads to get the Oxide inks mixed into them. You could ruin your ink pad. So just make sure you have separate foams, or at least you wash your foams before you switch. So I'm just going to ink that up, and I'm just going to blend that through And basically I just want a darker version of the cardstock that I'm using. And that's why I love that, you know, we have our color system where everything matches, because then you don't have to hunt for an ink that's going to work. Incidentally, Peacock Feathers is actually a good match for Lagoon. So if you need to use if you want to use the Oxide inks, you can. Peacock Feathers and Lagoon are pretty close as well. But I love that these match. And you get actually a little bit darker shadow using the Lagoon ink. So next I'm going to use White Daisy Pigment ink. Yes, it's the old style pads. I haven't gotten a new one. I don't use my pigment ink too often, but I do have a separate blending foam that's just for my white. So now we want to shift the stencil. It doesn't really matter what direction you shift it. I'm just gonna lift there we go. I'm just gonna kind of go down. I'm just going to offset it enough so that there's just about maybe 1/8 of an inch difference. And then I grab my pigment ink. I did end up with some color transferring onto my ink pad, so if that bothers you, you might want to squish some of the ink out onto your all-purpose mat, or you might want to skip this technique. But I found wiping over it afterwards with a baby wipe really lifted most of the ink, the color transfer in my white pad. You could also have, you know, one pristine white pigment ink pad that you use for stamping and things like that. And then you could have one that's maybe more of your messy one that is more for mixed media techniques or messier techniques like this. And then we lift off. And I love how this basically looks three-dimensional. Like, is that not so cool? So then I just set that aside and let it dry. Our second tag here is going to be offsetting the stencil in a little bit of a different way. So this, it can look a little crazy, but I love the effect of it. And remember, you can do this technique with any stencil design. I'm just choosing one to show you, but you can mix it up with all kinds of stencil designs. We have quite a few to choose from, and remember, we have stencil material, so you can cut stencils on your Cricut, which gives you huge flexibility. So I'm just putting this back in place again, sticking it down. I'm gonna grab my Lagoon ink pad again. All right, just dried off the stencil there. Now I'm going to lift up my stencil and I'm going to like completely offset it so that you can see the solid area is now going to be where the other hexagons meet. You could also, depending on your design, you could like rotate the stencil or flip it. Just depends on what stencil you're using, you know, and just try it out and see what looks cool. I like the way this looks, so I'm just going to grab my white pigment ink again, and the same thing, I'm just going to put a heavy coat of it. You will get a different look if you do a light coat as well, so you can play around with what you want to do. All right, and now comes the reveal. Ta-da! Isn't that fun? Oh, I love how that looks. It's a little trippy. Depending on the design you use, it can kind of boggle your mind a little bit. But I'm going to set that aside to dry. And then I have a card to show you. So I actually have two cards that I made with this technique. I did one 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch panel, and then I just cut it into two pieces, which allowed me to make two cards. So this is the new thanks die. I have the black ore cardstock on top, and then I layered a couple layers of just black cardstock underneath to make it nice and thick. This is some of the new holographic paper. I used the black ore cardstock over here as well. A couple little candles stamped there with some stickles on them. And the little stars are from the silver sequin mix. But I just thought those made some really fun, really simple, fast cards if you needed to make a whole bunch. I love that you can chop it into 2 pieces and get 2 cards out of 1 panel. This final technique for today is a really fun one. It's stamping through stencils. And I love the finished look of this. It looks probably more complicated than it really is. So it is an embossed resist, also with stamping. So first off, you have to pick the colors that you want to show up in those little diamond areas. And I'm gonna keep with my standbys here, and I'm gonna use mustard seed and picked raspberry for my base colors. All right, so I'm just gonna blend a quick, easy background, nothing too complicated, not taking a lot of time to do it. I basically just need some bright colors. I really like to use light or bright colors for this background because they will pop a little bit more when we add a darker color afterwards. And of course, using pink and yellow, you get a third color with orange. All right, I think that is pretty dry. We will see how we do here. So I'm going to put my tag on top of one of our little foam pieces that come in the stamp sets, because we are going to be stamping. And then I'm going to put my stencil down, also tape that into place, and I'm going to add another piece of tape down here because I really don't want this moving on me. And then you need some kind of background stamp. This is a set that I think is long retired, and I'm going to use this floral design. And you could peel this off, put it on a block, but I think I'm going to use mine just right on the carrier sheet. It allows me to get some good pressure and really press with my fingers. I'm going to use Archival ink. You could also use the Intense Black or just any black ink. All right, and then I am going to press this down. And now this is where it comes in nice if it's on the carrier sheet, because you can really just get your fingers in there and add pressure to the design really evenly. And I have that foam pad under there too, which really helps. Now, when you're picking designs to use for this technique, you want something that's a very tight, small design. You don't want something with like big open areas because it just doesn't translate well. You need something that is fairly tight and close together. I'm going to add another stamp of it here. If you have a nice small tiny design like this, it really shows up a lot better and makes sense when you see it in these small little pieces. Now if you use a small enough design, it is fairly easy to line up if you get kind of off when you start moving your stencil around. But what I'm going to do here is just pull up this bottom piece of washi tape, and I'm going to slide a piece of printer paper in there with the idea that hopefully it's not going to move. Now, I don't want to put my Versamark over this black ink, or I might end up with black ink all over my Versamark pad. So by putting the printer paper in there, I'm just taking a baby wipe and I'm just wiping this stencil. Now, because I used Archival ink, it's not all gonna come off, which is not a big deal. I think on my sample, I might have used Intense ink, which that one will come off. But you see, all that black ink would have transferred onto my Versamark, which would have not have made me happy. So I'm just going to put that down and make sure I get most of it. If I get a little bit of transfer, it doesn't hurt my feelings too much, but I just don't want a lot of transfer. Now, when I'm putting this back, I need to make sure that it didn't shift too much because I want it to still line up in those areas. So now I'm just going to press my Versamark. Another option too, instead of clear embossing this, you could use the transparent gloss texture paste. the gel, because you would get a similar look, but you wouldn't have to worry about using Versamark and embossing powder. Now we're going to pull up the stencil and pull this out here. And then I'm just going to add clear embossing powder over top of it. And that is why you want your distress inks that you use underneath to be dry before you move on to this step. Otherwise, it'll just cover the whole thing with embossing powder. Okay, I'm just gonna move these. I will wash that up later. Move them out of my way for now. And then I'm just gonna heat set this. All right, then I'm going to use the lovely peacock feathers to blend over top of this. And I'm actually just gonna move that washi tape off. And whatever color you choose to put over top, you wanna make sure it's gonna blend with the inks underneath, because they will layer over them a little bit. Okay, and then you can just take a towel or paper towel, whatever you have, and just wipe that off. And there you go. Fun little background. See here, once the inks are dried, they kind of soften up. Here is the card I made using these techniques. So you can see I used our stitched rectangle to make the background, and then I did the same process that I just showed you except on a bigger panel. Then I used the thanks die with 1 layer of white for the shadow and then 3 layers of black for the words, and I used the ore cardstock on top and then covered it with liquid glass so it is super shiny and dimensional. Wish you could see all these projects in person because they're always better in person, but hopefully that gives you some ideas of how to use these techniques for actual projects. So I wanted to show you that tag that is still working on drying. It's not 100% dry yet, but you'll see all those inks are bleeding through and coloring that texture paste. Some colors do move more than others. You can see the green is definitely moving a lot more than the blue. But I wanted to show you how that's starting to turn out. Looking very cool. So I hope you guys really enjoyed this little mini class and got some great ideas for using your stencils, your Oxide inks, mixed in with some of your other mediums. And I hope you will go and make some projects. All right, we'll see you later. Bye.